reading from Second Timothy, Paul encourages Timothy to continue in the work of evangelism. So it raises for us the question, what does it mean to be an evangelist? Well, in the case of Luke, clearly, he's one of the four evangelists of Scripture. That is, he's one of the authors of the four Gospels. An evangelist here is simply someone who writes a gospel, communicates a gospel. But this word evangelist or evangelism, it means some kind of commitment then to this gospel, some kind of understanding of what the gospel is, and some attempt to speak it, live it in some way. Of course, gospel is just our English word for good news. God meaning good, spell meaning news or story. So the gospel is giving good news. Well, we do something weird with this word in Christianity then. We take this word, good gospel, or in its anglicized Greek form, uh, evangel, and then we turn it into a verb. We evangelize. We evangelize people. This is to work the good news, to good news people. Christians go around good newsing at everyone. So what does it mean then to think of Luke as an evangelist, someone who is good newsing? Well, we might want to know a little bit about who this man is. And it's a bit interesting because he's not one of the disciples. He's quite clear about the fact that he's not an eyewitness to the accounts of the life of Jesus. He writes to someone called Theophilus. His birthplace is unknown, contested by scholars. There's even been some, DNA evidence that's been presented here from one of the historical tombs. He, uh, however, is more adept in the Greek language than most of the other authors of the New Testament. He gives us some of the finest Greek formations of the New Testament, which suggests that he's more at home in that language than the other authors. His writings contain a lot of what we call the hapax legomena, these unique Greek phrases or unique words and appearances that occur only within the writings of Luke. So Luke knows parts of the language that no one else uses. Luke is possibly a physician, according to Colossians 4. Putting all of these things together, he is possibly a Gentile. This is, again, not entirely settled. If he is a Gentile, he's the only known author of the New Testament who is not Jewish. So who is this Luke? He's not an eyewitness to Christ. But he does travel with Paul, it seems. Uh, he's mentioned a few times across the epistles attributed to Paul. And then throughout the book of Acts, the author uses the inclusive plural first person pronoun we all of the time. We were doing this, we were acting. And then at the end of his life, Paul, in our reading from Second Timothy, says that everyone else has abandoned him. They've all gone away. Only Luke is with me. Luke is the one who remains with Paul up until the end. And so actually, we don't know a lot about this Luke character. And yet, he wrote over a quarter of the New Testament. About if the works, Luke and Acts, are indeed written by the same author, and it is this Luke, then this is about 28% of the New Testament text, written potentially by a Gentile hand, a traveler with Paul, a potential physician. And because he's such a wordy author, he gives us many details that the other authors of the New Testament don't give. And this is where it's interesting. See, tradition has it that Luke is a historian. Now, of course, this word history summons up certain connotations for us as modern Western people. We think of the historian as someone who chronicles the facts of the past, that the historian is the one whose job it is to give us access to the factual events that occurred before us. But Luke's a historian not in terms of giving us a sequence of events, but he's a historian in the sense of telling a story that has meaning. So we sometimes call this diegesis, this idea that there's an intent that's here. Perhaps it's a bit more like being a documentarian than a historian. Luke, of course, is constructing his story about Jesus Christ, not from memory, but from interview or from encounter. He is gathering together and collating the knowledge of others and then putting them together into his story, a bit like a documentarian would interview people and then put together the life of Steve Wright. Well, if we start to minimize the factual aspect of Luke's gospel, not to say that it's not a factual account, but if we say that his approach to history is more invested in meaning than in fact giving, we might get a little bit worried. Because indeed, this is one of the perils that we're facing in our world today. A world in which we're struggling to find basic agreement over what is fact. What is actually happening in the world, even now, is something currently, constantly under dispute. In philosophy, we sometimes draw a distinction between fact and value, the things that happen and the values that we place upon them, or the values that actually animate our lives. And one of the things that philosophers since David Hume have observed is that it's very difficult to build values upon facts. And so if you find someone that you disagree with, giving them evidence isn't likely to change their mind. We struggle to agree on basic facts, and we live our lives according to values. Values shape our living much more than facts do. And so if this is the case, and Luke is an evangelist, we want to ask, well, what are the values that he is communicating in evangelizing? When he is out there good newsing, what are the values? Well, I was delighted to see that while the gospel was being read, we had one of the images of Luke sitting in front of a canvas. Luke is known as the first iconographer. Now, this is one of these attributions that perhaps doesn't have a lot of fact to it, but it certainly carries a lot of value. Uh, Luke is understood to have been the first iconographer, and this tradition is quite old. Although some historians have looked at the icons that allegedly were written by Luke and have said, well, these are very much in the 6th century style. So, maybe he was a real innovator, or perhaps he didn't actually paint icons. But the tradition of him painting icons is very fascinating. And we have many icons of Luke painting icons. And specifically, icons of Madonna and Child, of Mary and the infant Jesus. The value here is fascinating because Luke gives us the most expansive account of the infancy of Jesus. Actually, Luke does paint a broader picture of the infant Jesus, and he tells this story within the context of the sacrificial life of Israel. It starts with his little intro to Theophilus. Hey, Theophilus, I've done my best. Here you go. And then right into there was a priest. And this is where the story begins for him. It starts in the Jewish places of worship. He spends time then with this infancy. Another thing that comes through at this point is that Luke gives attention to women in the story who don't appear in the other accounts of this story. There are women who are named in Luke's gospel who aren't named in any of the other gospels. And he gives attention to the women who are here in the infancy of Jesus Christ. So he's an evangelist. He's telling the story of Christ. And in doing it, he starts to give attention and detail to people and places that aren't present elsewhere. He's not an eyewitness, but he is a witness. He passes on indirect knowledge that he's gathered. So Luke, we might say, takes a kind of strange path towards truth. And indeed, we don't all have to be eyewitnesses in order to come to knowledge of things, in order to come to some sense of truth. And so we have the two major texts that are attributed to Luke, Luke and Acts. Sometimes you get commentaries on them published as Luke Acts, a little hyphen joining them. That hyphen, of course, is the Gospel of John, which is inserted in between them in the New Testament. It's fascinating that if these two texts are by Luke, this two-part volume, we in our canon have not placed them together. They're punctuated by John's theological gospel. Okay, so what do we see with these two books? Well, Luke, the Gospel of Luke, is an account of the life of Jesus Christ, written from the perspective of the sources that Luke has had access to. He gives us indirect knowledge that's then gathered together and presented here. Acts, on the other hand, is written from the first person plural perspective. This is we, this is us. We were going, the Spirit stopped us. These are the things that are happening to Luke. And here, the story is not the story of Jesus Christ, the story is of the church of Jesus Christ. And here also, in this story of the church, Luke is giving interesting detail. Here he tells the story of the church that gathers its resources in order to distribute the money to those who are in need. Here he tells the story of the fall of the Spirit on the day of Pentecost, which allows people to hear the gospel in their own tongue, putting them at home within their own skins, not eradicating their culture, not forcing them to become Jewish in order to hear the gospel of Jesus Christ, but speaking to them in their own terms, in their own language. The Gospel of Luke is interesting too, because Jesus prays a lot in the Gospel of Luke, more so than in any of the other Gospels. And in Luke's Gospel, when Jesus prays, he tends to pray before major decisions. He prays before the calling of the 12, he prays before the transfiguration. Here we get these great parables about prayer. Prayer is a bit like being an annoying neighbor, where you knock on your neighbor's door, someone's turned up and I really need something to eat. And you're like, oh, kids are in bed or asleep, just go away. But because you're so annoying, God's going to get out of bed and give you what you need. It's wonderful, wonderful prayers. Of course, this story is actually a story of intercession. That's not, I have need, I'm going to really bother God. The person who is knocking at the door is appealing on behalf of someone else. Actually, they're in need. They've turned up, they're in need of hospitality, they're in need of food. They've come at the end of a long day's journey. And won't you get up, God, and give them something good? That's the kind of value that Luke is communicating when he tells stories like this. Jesus prays from the cross in the Gospel of Luke. His final words are a prayer addressed to the Father. He gives us Zacharias and Simeon and Mary as models of prayer in the Gospel. So Luke is very invested in this. And then prayer also emerges in the book of Acts. But where in Acts we are modeling ourselves after Christ, entering into the life of Christ. In the book of Acts, Christ has sent his Spirit, and then we follow the leading of the Spirit. And the Spirit indeed interrupts our plans, as happens in our reading from the book of Acts today. So these perhaps are some of these values that we see in Luke. Strangers are made at home, women are seen, people are turning to God in prayer on behalf of others. These are some of the values. What does it mean to say that Luke is one of the evangelists? Well, he is a witness, though not an eyewitness. He is recounting what he's seen, and he's abiding. Only Luke is with me, Paul says. He's with me until the end. You see, Luke's an evangelist not because he necessarily says the right things. It's not what comes out of him that makes him an evangelist. It seems to be what is said about him that makes him an evangelist. Only Luke is with me. Paul is recognizing something in Luke. So Luke is an evangelist. And Paul calls us, if we receive the words to Timothy, as words to us too. Paul calls to us to evangelize, to be out there good newsing this world. And so perhaps we can take Luke as a model, as someone who perhaps isn't an eyewitness, but is still a witness. Someone who is not an eyewitness, but someone who allows us to see. So I pray that we might be able to see, that we might be able to speak, that we might be able to abide, that we might be able to give voice, that we might be able to give attention to those who are in need. Amen.
With the